Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is April 24, 2024, and one of the series that we're running on the channel right now for the audiobooks is the First Wave USA Anti-Revisionism playlist, also known as the Anti-Browderism playlist, so named after Earl Browder, former General Secretary of the Communist Party of the United States, at one time a respected communist who wrote prolifically on various subjects including fascism, the labor movement, etc. Later, during World War II, disgraced and expelled from the Communist Party for a really awful revisionist, renegade, anti-Marxist turn, with the associated stances, positions, and policies becoming known as Browderism. So we have covered some of Browder's earlier writings, which demonstrate he actually knew what he was doing. He was a good communist. He studied theory, he was in touch with the international communist movement, and that's why he became General Secretary of the CPUSA. So in doing these readings, and particularly the turn in the 1940s that his writings took, a lot of people have asked, what happened to this guy? He clearly knew his stuff. Why would he turn his back on everything that the party stood for and basically his life's work up to that point? It's a great question, and a lot of people have speculated, this sounds like some kind of intelligence services got to him and basically forced him to change his position because it was just such an about-face, and then he started saying exactly what you would expect the US government to want a communist to say. But if that were the case, what would have been the circumstances under which that would have occurred? Well, this is speculative, but on the screen you have a citation from Syracuse University Libraries Special Collections Research Center. They have an Earl Browder collection. And it says, in 1940, Browder was convicted of passport fraud and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison in Atlanta, but his sentence was commuted by President Roosevelt after 14 months. In the election of 1944, Browder supported Roosevelt's re-election and presided over the dissolution of the United States Communist Party and the formation of the Communist Political Association. And that's basically where we just left off in our readings playlist. So like I said, it is speculative, but the timing definitely fits. In 1940, Browder had run for president on the Communist Party ticket, at which time he was still fighting this whole situation, which had arisen out of a scenario in 1939 that we're going to read about in just a second. But this is a pretty big switch from that, and admittedly there were some other things going on, like the US had not committed to World War II in the same way at that time, although Browder at that time viewed the war as an inter-imperialist war, and it is the Marxist-Leninist position that in an inter-imperialist war, a war between two imperial powers, well, two or more imperial powers or blocs, the policy is not to take a side and do lesser evilism, but to push for social revolution. The Marxist-Leninist position is that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. It can progress no further after that, and so the only way that you can get historical progress, unlike a national liberation war, is to root for the defeat of one's own government in the imperialist war, and then again organize for social revolution. So again, even that really shouldn't have been the decisive factor. Anyway, to get some more details on this, I'm actually going to turn to an odd source, alternatehistory.com forums. There's a post by David T. from August 2020 that I actually thought was pretty good. Let's just read it. It is September 5, 1939, and Earl Browder, head of the American Communist Party, is testifying before the Dies Committee. The party had not yet decided that the Second World War was an imperialist war on both sides. That was to come in a week after the Soviet press said so, and definitely had not yet broken with Franklin D. Roosevelt. That was not to come for several weeks. In fact, the break wasn't complete until FDR denounced the Soviet invasion of Finland. So Browder perhaps viewed the session as just another attempt by conservatives to embarrass FDR by linking the New Deal to the communists. In any event, he doesn't seem to have been on guard as much as he should have been. Ray Whitley, counsel for the committee, began the session by asking Browder if he had ever been known by any other names. This was a common question asked of witnesses, and Browder, unaware of the trap that was about to be sprung, said that he had used the pen names Ward and Dixon. Whitley dropped that line of questioning, and for several hours, Browder and the committee members, quote, sparred inconsequentially on the Communist Party's size, structure, and intentions. To quote Maurice Isserman's Which Side Were You On? The American Communist Party During the Second World War. Then, in the midst of the afternoon session, Whitley suddenly asked, Mr. Browder, have you ever traveled under a false passport? Amazingly, Browder answered, "I have," before the party's attorney, Joseph R. Brodsky, could stop him. Maybe Browder had just been lulled into carelessness by the hours of giving testimony, or maybe he thought he couldn't be prosecuted over those ancient false name passports from the 1920s. Anyway, Brodsky quickly alerted Browder to his blunder, and for the rest of the session, Browder invoked the Fifth Amendment. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Newspapers the next day carried headlines about Browder's admission. Even The Nation wrote that, quote, "Since Mr. Browder has admitted using a false passport, we do not see how the Department of Justice could avoid seeking an indictment." And Browder was indicted in October, with the Daily Worker headlining the story, "Browder held on flimsy charges as warmongers drive on civil rights." And you see a picture of Browder holding that newspaper there. It's dated October 24, 1939. The Justice Department lawyers did not at first like the way that the Dies Committee had forced their hand, but they eventually came to look on indictment for passport fraud as a seemingly non-political, non-First Amendment threatening way to satisfy public demands to crack down on the Communist Party as a fifth column. The First Amendment may protect advocacy of communism, but it certainly doesn't protect passport fraud. Besides, even if they had wanted to prosecute Browder for sedition, as incidentally Browder had done time in 1917 and 18 for protesting World War I. Anyway, there was no Federal Sedition Act, although that would soon be remedied by the enactment of the Smith Act. Anyway, as relations between the administration and the Communist Party deteriorated, the availability of the charges looked more and more providential. So Browder went on to trial in January 1940. The trial, before Alfred Cox, judge of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, was brief. The government's case was as follows. In 1934, Browder had written the word "none" on a passport application in answer to a question of whether he had previously held a U.S. passport. This was deliberately deceptive, said the government, since Browder had obtained 3 separate passports under assumed names during the 1920s. Quote, "Though the statute of limitations had long since expired for these violations," and maybe that was why Browder thought he was not endangering himself in admitting the existence of such passports to the Dies Committee, the government could still charge Browder with 2 counts of willfully and knowingly using the 1934 passport to return to the U.S. from abroad in 1937 and 38. Since he had not mentioned his earlier passports at the time of his 1934 application, the prosecution contended that Browder was guilty of using a passport obtained through giving false information. Quote, "Acting as his own lawyer, Browder contested the government's interpretation. In a 1.5-hour summation to the jury, he argued that when he had written the word "none" in 1934, he meant only to deny that he had any old passports in his possession to surrender at the time of application. Since the government had known of these other passports long before 1934, he argued, it could not have been deceived by his response at the time. The jury's verdict would depend on its judgment of Browder's mental state in answering "none" in 1934. Did he intend to deceive the U.S. government? Well, this was January 1940, and with the Nazi-Soviet pact, the Soviet invasion of Finland, and the widespread belief that the Communist Party was a fifth column, this was not a time that jurors were likely to give Browder the benefit of the doubt. The jury convicted him after 45 minutes of deliberations. Browder was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment, but he was freed on bail pending appeal. In view of these facts, it may seem idle to speculate on what would have happened had Browder been acquitted. Yet, after all, it only takes one juror to produce a hung jury. And even in 1940, there were some communist sympathizers in New York City. In a special election for Congress from New York 14, a heavily Jewish district on the Lower East Side, Browder got 13.56% of the vote, or 3,080 votes. Admittedly, that's a poor third in one of the Communist Party's strongest districts. In fact, his vote was about equal to the number of Communist Party members in that district. But is it really inconceivable that there would have been a communist sympathizer on the jury? Or maybe someone who just felt that Browder was basically being punished on a technicality in a politically motivated prosecution? Of course, with a hung jury, there can always be a retrial, but what if there's a holdout juror there too? Well, anyway, in reality, Browder remained free on appeal until March 25, 1941, which is when he surrendered to U.S. Marshals. He spent 14 months in prison, and then President Roosevelt reduced his sentence to time served. These 14 months were very hard on Browder. Yes, He had been imprisoned before in 1917 to 18 for refusing to register for the draft. He considered the First World War imperialist, just as he considered the Second World War, until June 22, 1941. But it was one thing to go to jail as a young revolutionary, and another to do so as a 50-year-old man with a wife and 3 children, and as the Earl Browder. Obviously, the Communist Party's basic policies during these months would not have been different if Browder had been actively heading the party in those months. The imperialist war, becoming a, quote, people's war after June 22nd, the switch from opposition to support of FDR, etc. And here, basically, the author absolves Browder of any of the responsibility and basically blames Stalin. So these policies were inevitable. Indeed, orders from Moscow weren't even necessary. All that U.S. communists had to do was to read the Soviet press to know what Stalin wanted of communist parties worldwide. However, Browder, years after his being expelled from the party, did claim that he had one difference with the line formulated by the party in his absence. So this is a quote. Browder later claimed that the communists in the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, major labor federation, went along with the no-strike pledge against his wishes while he was still in jail. Browder favored a no-strike policy. A pledge, according to Browder, implies that something will never be done, but a policy leaves room for striking when conditions so warrant. That's quoting Harvey Levenstein's Communism, Anti-Communism, and the CIO. However, as Levenstein notes, Browder's, quote, actions and statements during the war after his release lent little credence to this claim. Indeed, the Communist Party after Browder's return became more dedicated to labor peace and increased production than ever. Referring to a headline in the Trotskyist publication, The Militant, Earl Browder Strikebreaker was the headline, Browder remarked, quote, as regards the fomenting of the strike movement that threatens America at this present time, I consider it the greatest honor to be a breaker of this movement. One possible difference Browder not being convicted in 1940 might make, if FDR had tried but failed to have Browder convicted, he wouldn't have had the dilemma of whether to commute his sentence in 1942. His decision to do so was somewhat controversial and was used by the Republicans in trying to make anti-communism an issue in 1944, admittedly with only limited success. So again, thanks there to David T. for writing that up. I thought that was a pretty good summary with citations. So, June 12, 1942, here we see a picture of a newspaper from the Hoosier State Chronicles. Earl Browder is free. And it reads, Communist Party leader is shown on his arrival in New York City after serving a 14-month term, which was less than 1/3 of his 4-year sentence, in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Browder is not planning to resume his place as a secretary of the Communist Party, since he intends to work directly with war projects. So that's how it ended up, and then we start seeing all the pro-Tehran stuff in 1943, then the dissolving the Communist Party in 1944, which again is where we left off in that playlist. I also just want to call your attention, you can find this online. It's a little pamphlet, it's like 22, 23 pages long. The title is The Browder Case, A Summary of Facts, A Brief for Justice and Fair Play in America. And basically, this was a pamphlet that was circulated by supporters of Earl Browder at the time when he was fighting these charges, and it lays out some arguments very similar to what we just read that Browder had used in court in his defense. They revolve around how heavy or harsh the punishment for Browder was compared to other documented cases of passport fraud. Basically saying, okay, maybe he screwed up on this, but they are throwing the book at him because he's a communist, basically. And it ends with this appeal to help free Earl Browder. You can A, write or wire President Roosevelt asking for the release of Earl Browder from Atlanta Penitentiary. Have your trade union or other organization do the same. You can organize a local citizens committee to free Earl Browder. You can hold public meetings. You can get petitions from this coalition and then circulate them, and so on. So there was certainly public support and an entire political party behind the release of Earl Browder. However, was it simply that this coalition was able to appeal to FDR's good conscience? Or was a deal struck like, hey, we'll let you out, but you got to tone it way down and it really wouldn't hurt if you said XYZ, otherwise you might find yourself back in prison. Or maybe even worse. Now, we don't know. I don't know at least. This is speculative like I said before. However, the timing, again, is suspect. On the other hand, there was a somewhat opportunist People's Front policy in operation at that time in the international communist movement. Was this an example of just taking it too far, or what? Well, what do you think? Let us know in the comments below, and we will continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as a few dollars a month or more, or a one-time donation, whatever you see fit. Every contribution is encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend more time on it while also keeping it non-commercial and ad-free. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, even if it's just thanks, good video, or random letters. And finally, remember that you can agitate and educate pretty extensively online, but organizing takes place in the real world. Connect with your local left, take what you've learned here on the channel and in the rest of your Marxist studies into that movement with you. Join the class struggle, network with comrades, find out what's going on, propose projects, do what you can. There is a lot going on. If you're in a city, you're likely to probably meet up with multiple groups. If you're in a more rural area, you might have to join up with something on more of a statewide, regional, or even national level, but you can do it. It's worth it, and we need you to act. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next video.